Good morning. This is Jason Dean, back at again, back at it again from live coming at you from Film Fanatic headquarters here in the big city of Northport, Maine. Hope everyone's doing good. I want to continue to always. I try to always, with every episode, every show, try to always thank the people out there on the World Wide Web, particularly all the folks that have been chiming in and checking out the YouTube page. It's been really fabulous. Though all the numbers have been going up. I'm at just about 170 now, so it's been really awesome. And the coolest thing is that more and more people are, commenting, and I love hearing feedback about the shows. And a lot of folks have been really saying some nice things about the videos. And just the other day, I got in a conversation with a guy who seemed to really appreciate the stuff I was doing and the content. So the two things I love most about this whole channel and doing this whole thing is, well, it's two things. My favorite part is interacting with people who also have a deep love with film. I really love that, and that is all part of the really the essence of this whole channel. Is it's not really about me. It's not the Jason Dean show per se. It's really about trying to bring a lot of movies that I love, and a lot of movies that I discover, and what the whole film world means to me, and what it does for me as far as inspiring me. If you want to say or call it like in a very like artistic way, and also just a personal way, where it goes beyond just being entertainment for me. At the end of the day, it's all entertainment, but it goes up beyond a deeper thing. It goes to a deeper thing, where it influences, kind of how I try to present my life. And also, even like, I'm a big fan of aesthetics, and close friends of mine who know that I, have an affinity or love for darker things, I guess you could say, darker aesthetics. My house is more or less decorated for Halloween all year round. That's a big influence of film and that whole kind of allure to that aesthetic. So I take a lot of that as very inspired by film, and so that's just my personal life. And it's a huge, the biggest influence on my writing, as far as my music that I write and create for my band Quantum. So it really has a big impact, and really at the end of the day, it's about bringing these films to, giving a little bit of coverage to some films that are maybe pretty obscure, or films that are maybe forgotten about. And if you're a fan of horror, science fiction, I love to trace back the origins to where a lot of these things came from. And as well, I do cover movies that are quote unquote Hollywood films that are much bigger, or that are commercial in a sense. And I don't really discriminate when it comes to art or film. I think if something's good, regardless, it just you know it shines through regardless. I went to a friend's open mic last night in Camden, Maine, and it was a really great time. And I remember briefly having this conversation with somebody where, with a guitar player, and he was saying how he has kind of discovered this band, a local band that plays like real traditional, bluegrass kind of stuff. But he said it was really, really good, and it's like high level stuff. And he was saying how, and it was funny the way he was wording it. He was saying, "Well, it's not something I usually like. It's not really a style of music. I'm not really. He's more of a rock and roll guy, and he's not really into like straight up Americana or bluegrass." But he said their music is so good that it doesn't really matter what genre it is. It's like if it's, it's got a sincere quality to it. The artists have put a lot of love and care into what they do, and it you know it crosses out of that boundary of, well, you should only like it if if that style is your jam. And it's like, and I thought that was a cool conversation because he was saying, it's not my jam, but it's something I love. And then I was talking about it with him too. It's like, yeah, it comes back to that same thing of like, if something's of good quality and it resonates with you, it doesn't really matter what style it is. It doesn't matter what genre it is. It just resonates with you, and and that's it. That's at the end of the day, that's all that really matters. So at this channel, I try to bring a lot of variety, uh, to it. I think there's that famous quote, and I think it's by, I could be wrong, but I think it's uh, accurate, by the famous trumpet player Dizzy Gillespie, world renowned, world famous jazz trumpet player, and he had talked about, there was an interview he gave or something many 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 years ago, and he was talking about the idea of like music and categories and genre and what people like, what people don't like. And he said that he was talking about in this interview that he loved blues, he loved classical music, he loved early ragtime jazz, he liked rock and roll. Like basically, he said that he loved all of these different styles of music. And he said that for him, music for him is like, it's either good or it's bad, or it's well done, it's good quality, or it's not. It doesn't He doesn't look at it as defined by genre, and that right away gives you like this kind of built-in discrimination against it, because, oh, that's not my jam. Good music just transcends that. And I feel like with film, it's the same exact thing. But at the end of the day, too, we all have things, we all have genres or styles that we, maybe spend most of our time or occupying, say, that particular world. And I'm definitely that way, too. I spend most of my time watching horror and science fiction films, and particularly like the low budget grindhouse films. Like I love all kinds of films, but that's my jam. Like that's my bread and butter. That's my favorite style, particularly movies in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. So this is a show about a really, I feel like, I mean, for what it is, a really iconic movie, and a movie that introduced me to the great and wonderful Herschell Gordon Lewis, who I discovered not all that long ago. It was probably about 3 or 4 years ago, and I've talked about Herschell Gordon Lewis before. I did a few shows back when I was doing Facebook Live videos, when I was first diving into, or trying out, doing live video reviews and interviews on Facebook. I did a show on on Herschell Gordon Lewis where I just talked about basically him as a director and a bunch of his films. And then since then I did a bunch of, I know I've done like a handful of videos on that were also on Facebook. I did a handful of videos where I talked about specific movies. And I did a show, since I've made this transition to just doing videos for the YouTube channel, the Film Fanatic YouTube channel. I started. I've only done one Herschell Gordon Lewis movie. I did one on Blood Feast, which is probably my favorite of his films. It's looked at to be probably, you know, amongst like his fans, probably the most popular film. Me personally, like Blood Feast is my favorite film. I really love. I also really love Wizard of Gore. That's a show I'll do eventually. And the other movie that I really really love of his, that's actually like a close. It might. It's pretty much right up there with Blood Feast, or a close second. and it was actually my first introduction to Herschell Gordon Lewis, and that is 2000 Maniacs. Just I was when I first saw this, I kind of couldn't, I didn't, I couldn't believe what I was watching in a lot of ways. And again, it's like Herschell Gordon Lewis. I discovered him probably about 3 or 4 years ago. Like I've said before, I usually go when I rent. I actually rent movies, and I go to Opera House Video in Belfast, which is really the only. There's like one other shop, I think. I can't remember what it is. There's like a little mom and pop video place. It's about maybe an hour or two away from here. I can't remember the name. I've never been to it, and they actually rent movies, and it's a little video store in this kind of convenience store slash gas station. They actually rent movies, but it's pretty small. I think I've been in there once. I think it might be in Warren or Waldoboro. I could be mistaken. But as far as I know, and as far as I believe, the only actual full-on video rental place is still Opera House Video. Everything else is closed, and it's amazing that they're still going. And they have a really good selection of films, and it's gotten better and better over the last like couple of years. They're really cool about Dennis Howard, who runs that great place, and he's also the owner. He's really cool about listening to his clientele. Like if someone goes in there and recommends a film that, and they might be a customer, say like me or whatever, that goes there, all the time. I don't go there quite as much just because I've been buying more movies, and I've been kind of immersing myself in that world, because I've been buying lots of new films over the past couple of months, and I've just kind of been living in that world. But I still go there, every, a couple times a month or so. I used to go every week, but I have a lot of stuff that I've been getting to on my own that I own, and it's been, a total blast. But it's been great because he'll like, films that maybe a loyal customer will like suggest. He'll seek them out and bring them and get them in the store. He's done that a couple times for me, and I know there's like one or two other customers that go in there probably more than I do, and that spurred on Dennis ordering certain films. So his catalog of films has really expanded even more the last couple of years. So it's been really cool, and I think that's great that he does that. It seems too like whenever he does that, those particular films get some traction and expand a little bit and become pretty profitable to a degree of people start checking them out. And he has a pretty good selection. I mean, obviously he's got all of the Hollywood blockbusters, the films that come out that are fairly popular, and then he's also got one of the biggest components of Opera House Video is they have a massive television section for like all of the series that are available that were on some kind of streaming platform at some point. They have tons of new releases. They have a really good horror selection, really great drama section, and action section. So, and they have a pretty good foreign film selection, which is pretty impressive. So they've always had a good thing, and feels like it's gotten even more beefed up over the years. And especially when it comes to one of the things I've noticed too, when it comes to films that are a little bit more obscure, and also films that are kind of considered quote unquote B movies or like exploitation movies, he actually has a pretty good selection of those kinds of films, like pretty obscure films. Um, there's a few films that I've checked out over the years that he has that I've really grown to love. Like one particular film which I really want to get really soon, and I saw it the other day and I didn't buy it, and I kind of regret it. But it's just an awesome movie called Street Trash, which is this early '80s exploitation movie, and it's pretty gonzo and pretty nuts. That was one movie I saw, and then there's another film I think it's called Daughters of Frank, and it's just this totally bizarre, uh, weird, uh, just such a strange movie. But it's definitely like an exploitation movie, and it's a pretty disturbing movie. But they had that there, and it's super low budget. And then they also have these compilation DVDs where they have these little mini box sets that they rent there that are, and you can rent them for like $5, and they each have like 20 movies on them. Lots of shorter films, and they're all like these weird exploitation movies. And I've checked out a few of those, and lots of fun. But that's how I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis. I got one. It was about 3 or 4 years ago. I got one box set that he had, and it had a collection of like 20 or 30 of these like really low budget exploitation movies. Some are science fiction, some are horror, some are like crime exploitation movies, and I had never seen any of them. And there was a movie on in this one particular set, and it was 2000 Maniacs. And that movie, when I first watched it, it just blew me away. I couldn't believe it because it was made in 1964, and the level of gore and violence in this film was like kind of unprecedented, and it's totally insane, and it's totally bonkers. The whole premise of the movie is basically centered on this community in the deep South in the 50s, early 60s, where this all of these Southerners and Confederate soldiers were basically killed during the Civil War, and every time the anniversary comes up of of all of these people dying, they basically all of these dead Confederate soldiers and that community that where they lived basically come back to life, and they come back as these ghosts, and they basically wreak havoc on people who come through the town, especially Northerners. And it's centered on this group of people from the North that come down there, and they these ghosts come back and basically capture them and torture them and kill them, and it's completely insane. And it's one of those movies that I wonder if like if that film, if 2000 Maniacs came out now, how it would go over, or if it would go over at all, like if it would even be allowed to be made, because it's it raises a lot of issues with kind of where we are socially as a culture. There's with all of the last few years with the protests and all of the things that we've gone through with the social unrest, and particularly with a lot of the southern monuments that were basically documenting the what happened in the South with these stone statues that were raised in the South over the celebration of the Confederate states, and also in light of all of those statues basically being torn down, and then also the idea of where the balances of some of those states where they can fly the Confederate flag, and and the contemporary society, or the world in which we live in now, we're really questioning that and seeing that and realizing the racist ideology that truly represents. So, and this film is totally steeped in that, and so it's really interesting and wild. And so it's not. I feel like it would be highly controversial if a film like that came out now. If 2000 Maniacs came out now, particularly around the imagery and the whole kind of the whole the all of the antics that are on because the Confederate flag being shown, and all of those Southern icons that were shown during the time of the Civil War. But on a not so serious side, it's also just a completely insane movie. And Herschel Gordon Lewis, he started out as basically an advertising guy. He worked for before he became a filmmaker. He was essentially an ad man, and he worked for these different companies where he was in charge of advertising and doing commercial work to promote these companies. So his specialty was basically advertisement, and then he eventually got into film, and he worked exclusively with this producer Dave Friedman, who was his background, and he's one of my favorites too. Dave Friedman's background was he eventually joined and started working with Herschell Gordon Lewis. And Dave Friedman had a background in filmmaking, producing films. He's also directed one or a few films of his own, but he mostly produced films. But he worked mostly in the porn industry before, like the early forms of like the first kind of sex movies that came out in the, even in the late mid to late 50s. And then he also worked in various other exploitation movies, crime exploitation movies, mostly mostly the sex exploitation world, where he would shoot these films or be involved with these films where they were shot like nudist colonies, and they're really bizarre and really strange. And he started a partnership with Herschell Gordon Lewis, and then they started working together. And they also did some of those, like they call them nudie pictures. And this was in the late 50s. And they did a lot of, these crime exploitation movies. And then eventually they moved into working in horror films. And I believe Blood Feast was like his first like horror film. And he, was looked at and regarded as like the God Father of Gore. And it's really interesting because, if you're a fan of, say, slasher movies or movies that have, copious amounts of blood and violence, it really, at the end of the day, it really is an interesting thing to see, maybe where that came from, because, like, for example, yesterday I watched the trailer for the new Evil Dead movie that's coming out, and I think it's the fourth movie in the series. And I'm a big fan of the Evil Dead franchise. I really loved, I mean, the original by Sam Raimi. I mean, just an iconic movie. I love all the other of the other films, the remake that came out, or Part Two, Evil Dead Two, and then Army of Darkness is pretty amazing. And I also like the remake that came out about 10 years ago, which is kind of like essentially a reboot. That's an awesome movie. I think overall in the franchise, obviously the first one being just one of the most iconic gore fest movies ever, and then also the remake. I just think that movie is just incredible. It's very different too, and it's really dark. Um, it's an awesome movie, and I'm contemplating doing a show or another series, which I think I'm going to do. I'm going to do a series on all of the Evil Dead films in celebration of this new one, because the new trailer for this newer film I thought looked just absolutely incredible. And so, and it looked incredibly gory, very, very gory, like a good Evil Dead movie should be. So, and those films are hugely popular. And, slasher films are hugely popular. And also, you know, gore in horror films is one of the biggest attractions for the fans, and myself included. So for me, I always like to think about, wow, where did this stuff kind of come from? Where, like, and in certain films you get into, my introduction to horror films, as far as like, I guess you could say, or call it slasher films, and films that showed lots of gore and practical effects, was the first Friday the 13th, and also that franchise. As a kid, those were the first like slasher movies I ever saw. That was like my introduction, and I had seen a bunch of other ones around that time, but that was my introduction to that whole world. And being such a fan of that genre, I was always like curious, like, wow, I wonder, like, as I got older, I was like thinking about, I wonder, when Sean Cunningham created the Friday the 13th franchise, was he the guy who started the use of practical effects in horror, and also the use of like copious amounts of gore and also sex in films? Was he like the first guy? Like, is that where it started? And the older I got, at that time too, shortly after I got into uh, it was Friday 13th, and then I got into a lot of the Hammer horror films, which I deeply love, and eventually I want to do shows on those because those were a real love of mine as a kid, and it remains to be. They still remain a big part of my horror DNA, if you want to call it that. And then I also got into a lot of I was exposed to a lot of Italian horror movies, like zombie movies, and I got into Lucio Fulci. So like as a kid, it was the Friday 13th series was my introduction, and then I got into the Hammer horror films right around that time, and then along that during that time too, I started seeing films like The Gates of Hell and The House by the Cemetery and a bunch of other films that were, films by Dario Argento, Bruno Mattei, whole bunch of those Italian directors that were also doing, really gory movies and graphic films, and that whole world was like, you know, that was my childhood as far as films go. And when I got a little bit older, and I would, look at where, say, a lot of the Italian films came from, I realized, and over time, that these films, and I realized too, like Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci were actually doing those kinds of films before the American films. Like, say, case in point, Sean Cunningham, the creator of the Friday 13th series. And I always thought that was interesting. Like, wow, like these Italian directors were doing these, gruesome practical effects in these horror movies, probably about 10 years or so uh, before a lot of American directors. I feel like a lot of American directors, particularly in the exploitation world, the slasher world, were deeply, deeply influenced by European horror and especially Italian horror. Like I said, Lucio Fulci and Bruno Mattei, uh, Dario Argento. I mean, the list is endless. Um, and it was really, eye opening because I remember, oh, okay, this is where it goes back. It goes back even further, the origins of horror and practical effects. So these guys, the Italian directors, were predated the American directors by quite a few years, and obviously that was a huge influence on the Americans. But when I discovered Herschell Gordon Lewis about 3 or 4 years ago, and when I first saw 2000 Maniacs, I was just completely floored that this came out in 1964, and I was like, holy crap! Like, and this movie is like, again, uh, it's Herschel Gordon Lewis isn't probably for everyone. I mean, he's not really, like, some people don't even really regard him as, say, a director per se, because the nature of his films are so low budget, they're so grimy, and they're so sleazy, and they're just so goofy and silly. But I definitely regard him as a director. Like, I look to him as, on one hand, like, he didn't really take himself that seriously, or either did Dave Friedman, but they also realized that they were in the business of exploitation, and that they had this audience, a small, like, cult audience that loved their material, and they were devouring their material. So they really milked it because they were exploitation filmmakers, and that was like the number one focus of their business. But I think that at the end of the day, when you look through all of his films, and since I've bought this movie, I pretty much have all of Herschel Gordon Lewis's films on Blu-ray now, and I'm looking forward to doing more and more coverage of his movies because he's one of my favorite directors. And one thing I do notice, like, even though his movies are just like so utterly ridiculous and entertaining as all hell, they he definitely had a particular style. Like there was a method to his madness. Like he wasn't really, a quote unquote skilled director. He did all of these crazy unconventional things, at least when he would shoot films. Like the Blood Feast is a great example. Blood Feast is a great example because there's the whole scene towards the end where there's a scene with these garbage men, and when the police are after the main villain from Blood Feast, they capture him, but he ends up going into this area where there's these garbage men, and they kind of capture him, but then he ends up getting thrown into the garbage truck, and he gets crushed, and it's totally hilarious and ridiculous. But that's an example of where like Herschell Gordon Lewis literally like found these two guys on the street that had this garbage truck. They were real life garbage men, and he basically approached them on the street and he's like, "Hey, do you want to be in my movie?" And had no experience at all in filmmaking or being actors, and they were in the film, and the rest is history. But it's amazing. Like it's so terrible, but the way it's put together, it's amazing, and it totally works. So he was like, Herschel Gordon Lewis was notorious for like doing so many movies on. He was really prolific, and he made so many films with so little money. But one of his practices was that he would just grab random people on the street that he would come across and basically throw them into the movie, and it just gives the movie this real pulpy, strange vibe to it. And I think it just adds. It's definitely an example. It adds to the movie, but it's definitely a primetime example of it's so bad it's good, and it's very pulpy. It gives it this real pulpy, raw kind of feel, and that's what I really love about his films. And he was notorious because he had no budget for any of these films, or virtually no money. He did, pretty much one take of every scene. Like he just kind of chopped up all of these scenes and footage, but because he was so limited to what he could do, he just like did these one or two takes of each film and just kind of got everything together. And he worked really quickly. He worked incredibly at this really intense, fast pace all the time, and he just turned out all these movies. And it gives the films these like these wild looks. This it gives it this it gives the film this incredibly strange kind of aesthetic to it. And when I discovered this movie, I was blown away because it's pretty gory. It's really uh, it's it's really funny. It's like it plays like a comedy, but it also like has this. And I don't know if it was intentional by Herschel Gordon Lewis because I don't think he took himself that seriously. Um, like he even said he didn't really consider himself to be like an artist. There are people out there that look to him as because he was so unconventional and so outside of the box as a filmmaker. People do regard him that take him really seriously, and they regard him as like this kind of serious artist. And I think that might be a little bit of a stretch. I mean, he definitely left his mark, and I think in some ways I do look to him as at one point being a visionary and way ahead of his time as far as when it comes to horror films because when I discovered him and this film like I said this came out in 1964. This was my introduction to Herschel Gordon Lewis. I was blown away by the amount of violence in this film and how on one hand it's like kind of like a comedy and it's super silly and terrible and goofy, but then it also has these subjects in the film, these kind of societal taboos that that are kind of shocking and really disturbing. And the use of violence. I mean, it's really gory and it's really graphic at times. There's one scene where these ghosts, these southern ghosts, that they capture this group of these northerners, and they take them on top of this hill, and they put them in these big baskets or these big like tubs, and they stick these before they put them in, and they have these people captured. Before they put them in these tubs, they stick all of these daggers and swords and blades in it. So the blades are all coming through inside these big barrels, and they throw the people in it, and then they wheel these barrels down the hill, and it's super gory and like super nasty. Like, and to think that this stuff was done in 1964 was like mind-boggling. And there's also a scene where there's a one victim where one they're both tied up with these horses, and on one end is a horse that's tied to this with a rope. His legs are tied to this horse, and then there's another horse where that's also tied to his arms. So basically, they kick the horses off, and his body is like ripped apart. And it's super graphic, and to think that this stuff came out in '64 is just like whoa, like, and it's pretty gory. I mean, it's super cheesy, but it still makes an impact. So when I was like getting into his films, and I realized, wow, like he was doing this stuff way ahead of its time, way ahead of its time. I couldn't believe it. So that's when I realized, wow, like, so I went from thinking, okay, the early '80s slasher films, the example that I've been using, like say, the Friday 13th films. I thought at one point, oh, okay, this is where kind of the origins of horror have started. The use of copious amounts of gore, practical effects. This is kind of where this is where it started. And then after a few years, and then as I got older, I realized, no, no, it was actually the Italians were the first ones to do it. You know, Lucio Fulci and Dario Argento, Bruno Mattei, all those guys. I felt, okay, well, actually, no, it was the Italians and the European directors that started this kind of genre. And then, but when I discovered Herschell Gordon Lewis, that's when I realized, oh no, it wasn't the Italians. It was actually Herschell Gordon Lewis who actually started this whole genre. And that's to me is the most fascinating part of kind of this journey as a deep lover of film, is seeing like where this stuff comes from, and to think that he was putting out Herschel Gordon Lewis was putting movies out in the early '60s, late '50s even. I have one of his films that is from like 19, I think it's from 1957 or 1958, and it's this really raunchy sex exploitation movie, but it's like really kind of rough, and it's hard to believe that like that came out. And then about the early '60s was when he kind of moved into doing horror films. And so to me, that's one of the most fascinating parts is tracing that lineage. And so if you're a fan of horror, and it could be whatever, it could be any style that you're into. Like say if you're into murder mystery movies, like say I just did a show on The Glass Onion and Knives Out, and those are like kind of like modern day versions, contemporary versions of like the classic kind of Agatha Christie story. So like for example, like if you like those kinds of murder mystery whodunit films and you really get into that, you might have an interest to see, oh, like where did this come from? Where did this like particular genre, originate? Where how did it evolve to where it's this film now, like Glass Onion or Knives Out, and you trace it back, and before you know it, you're in the '50s or '60s, and then you're like, oh wait, this you know even goes maybe even further before, say, the classic Sherlock Holmes, Agatha Christie thing. So you can trace that lineage, and at the same time, it also introduces you to so many other filmmakers. But I always find that fascinating, and you could do that with really any genre, like say action movies or like Hong Kong martial arts movies. So I love doing that, and especially when I discovered Herschel Gordon Lewis was actually doing these kinds of movies way before anybody else. I was blown away, and it totally changed my mind as far as the order or the lineage of a style of film that's really this beloved style that I have a deep love for, and kind of where it came from or where it originated. So really cool stuff. Yeah, Herschel Gordon Lewis is the man. I love these packages. are just so so damn good. They have so many. They've reissued all of his stuff basically on Blu-ray, and it's just so incredible. And this is from Arrow. I think this is the Arrow company that's done these that's responsible for these films. Yeah, Arrow is the company that's put out all of Herschell Gordon Lewis's films, and they're a really great company. But these editions for the treatment that his films like, because they're on some level they're or in one level they're like kind of just pieces of trash, but to see them get this like immaculate treatment on Blu-ray and even 4K is just completely insane. Because I kind of feel like if you like exploitation movies and you like the real gritty kind of grindhouse kind of thing, I almost feel like these are as probably as rough and as ready as you can go. Like this is like the ultimate kind of deep dive. Like his films are just so raw, and I kind of feel like if that's your jam and if it's something you're into and if it's a world that you want to explore, I kind of feel like this is like the deepest, the deepest area of the pool. And to see that these films are on Blu-ray and 4K is just like crazy, and they're all like remastered, and the quality is amazing, and the special features on these packages. And again, like I said, I have most of his films all through the Arrow company. I have most of his films now on Blu-ray. Uh, the special features are just wild. There's all these great interviews. There's some really awesome interviews with Herschel Gordon Lewis on all of the discs, and this one in particular, and also with Dave Friedman, who produced a lot of his horror films. And there's a lot of bonus movies. They actually put movies on a lot of these discs of his older films, his films that are even more obscure. So it's such an awesome package. These are some of my favorite Blu-rays. I mean, he's definitely one of my favorite directors. As ridiculous and insane as he was, I mean, you gotta love it. You gotta love him. You gotta, you gotta give him props for doing this crazy shit before anybody else. And and I think he, without a doubt, whether you consider him, say, a filmmaker per se or an artist, he definitely left his mark, without a doubt. And his influence, it's a small audience, but people that are into his stuff devour his work. So, and I'm one of those. So definitely check this out. This was my introduction to the great Herschel Gordon Lewis, 2000 Maniacs. So so damn good. So this is Jason Dean, and we will see you next time. Have a great day. Peace.